The canoe brigades would run from a single, what they called express canoe. Sometimes they would want to get messages from one place to another, or a document, or like George Simpson, the chief poopah with the Hudson Bay Company that wanted to overview all the sites. They would have up to 8 and 10 paddlers in them, because they were trying to make speed. But typically in the north canoe, the 25-foot north canoe, the 30-foot Batard, and the 34-foot Montreal canoe, they would run between 4 and 8 crew per boat. A lot of it would depend on the gear they were carrying as well. And in the later years, they carried more people to carry about the same amount of goods, but they had more people in them because they didn't have as hardy as souls in the later 1800s that they did at the beginning of Thompson's era anyway, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So. The brigades usually ran anywhere from 1 or 2 canoes up to 5 in different groups, depending on where they're going. They may run up, they would use the 34-foot canoes, 38-foot canoes on the Great Lakes from Montreal up to Fort William or Grand Portage. And then from there they would use the smaller canoes to go upstream into the fur trading areas and whatnot. But they would usually send them out in groups of 4 or 5, but they might send one canoe off after they got a couple 100 miles up on this one, or to different points. The idea was to leave, if you were overwintering, say in Rocky Mountain House, you left early in the spring as soon as it was possible to get on the river and make that journey to Old Fort William, take the furs in, and then stock up with trade goods to come back and make that round trip journey in approximately 5 months. So it was, as soon as the ice went out, you went, and there was probably ice on the river when you were getting back. So it was a non-stop 7 days a week thing for them. The only time they took a break is when they had the big rendezvous at Old Fort William or Grand Portage, and they'd have a couple of days where they partied it up and got ready to go again. Well, these are a few items that were used to make birch bark canoes. And what we have here is birch bark that is from the eastern side of the Rockies. Birch bark has to grow in very cold weather in order for it to become thick and have a good rind on it. If you look at this, it's just like shoe leather. This was dried out, but the rind here is over 1/8 of an inch thick on this. This is bark from Minnesota, actually. And this is the exterior of the bark. The way the birch bark canoes were made is that the canoe was built from the outside in. So what they would do would be to take a big sheet of birch bark, and they would find a tree and strip up to a 30-foot length of bark. And of course the trees in those days were huge. They could get a piece 5 and 6 feet wide. And they would take that bark and lay it in to stakes pounded in the ground to give the rough shape of the canoe, and then they would start building from the inside out, or the outside in, I'm sorry. So once the bark was put in, this would be the exterior of the canoe when it's finished, and that's the inside part that goes up against the cambium layer in the tree when it's peeled off. They would put this in, then they would form different ribs. They would split out cedar if they had it, or spruce, or pine, and make ribs. They were all carved with what they call a crooked knife. Now this was after the Europeans arrived. The natives built them with the stone knife that we show in the native section. But this is a crooked knife, it has a curved blade on it, and all of the pieces like this were cut and smooth, shaped to fit. Then these were forced into the bark to give the canoe its shape. The stitching that was done, this is an example of stitching. The materials used were spruce root in most cases. And this is a root that grows underground off of the spruce, and they would pull long sections of this out of the ground, and then it was split. And it's very pliable when it hasn't dried out like this has. And then they're able to stitch it. And this is an example of two pieces of birch bark that have been stitched together. And you can see how the stitching makes a solid seam on both sides. Now this will leak, so this has to be sealed. So what would be done on the exterior of the canoe, which would be this, they would take pitch. This is the resin from the trees that accumulates in chunks like this on the side of trees. They would take this and melt it down in a pot, add a little bit of charcoal to it and a little bit of fat to make it more pliable, and then they would gob it on with a stick. And when you see a birch bark canoe and you see all those black lines, that's what this is the pitch with some ash in it and some bear fat. When this hits the water, if you don't have bear fat in the melted pitch, it's too rigid and it'll break so easily. So if you put the fat in there, it keeps it a little bit more pliable in the cold waters and keeps the canoe sealed so that the precious furs and trade goods don't get wet. This was a technique purely created by the Aboriginal tribes, and there's many styles of canoes that are built from birch bark and adapted to other types of bark, pine bark being one of them that the Kalispels and Kootenays used to build their sturgeon nose canoes.